Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening. I'm Jeff Dunn, Director of the Prindle Institute for Ethics and also Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Philosophy Department here at DePauw. And it's great to see you all this evening. It's a great turnout. I was just saying I feel like a flight attendant on Southwest Airlines when they get down to boarding class C, and it's just like pointing out seats, just middle seats left now. So it's great to see you all here. Tonight we're having a courageous conversation in ethics, which is an event series that we do that examines tricky, challenging moral issues from a variety of different perspectives. These aren't debates in a classic sense. Rather, they're sort of opportunities for several people who have differing views on the same moral issue to engage in constructive dialogue with each other. And the way it works is we're going to have a moderated discussion with our participants here. After that, we're going to have a question and answer session where you, the audience, can get involved in the discussion yourself. So we're really looking forward to that. Tonight, the topic, which I'm sure you know, is the ethics of eating meat. Let me introduce our participants. Our first panelist is Joseph Porter. There's Joseph. Very nice. Joseph is the Nancy Schaenen Endowed Visiting Scholar of Ethics at the Prindle Institute and joins us from UNC Chapel Hill, where he recently earned his PhD in philosophy. Our second panelist is Jennifer Everett. Jen's a professor in the philosophy department here at DePauw and also holds the Blair Anderson and Martha Caroline Reith Chair in Applied Ethics. And moderating tonight's discussion is Christian Weishart, host of the Prindle Institute's Examining Ethics podcast. Woo! So I'll now turn things over to Christian. And I was going to say, but please help me in welcoming our guests, but you've already done that. But we can do it again. Let's welcome our guests.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So this is not a debate, but if they get into a fist fight, I'm prepared. Like, I'm ready. We're good. I just wanted to say before we start the discussion that this is the kind of question that really easily lends itself to questions about facts and figures and sciencey kind of things. And we're going to cover the moral side of things tonight more than the sciencey side of things tonight. We're certainly going to talk about facts and figures, but we're going to talk about bigger picture questions tonight. So, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is a really fascinating question because humans are in a really unique position in the animal kingdom. We're biologically omnivores, right? We can eat plants, animals, right? But a lot of us choose to only eat vegetables or to only eat meat. And furthermore, we're unique because we can make those choices from a place of values, right? It's not just a question of what fills us up or what makes us healthy. It's also a question of the values that we hold. So my first question to both of you, before you tell us what your particular perspectives on this issue are, I think it'd be good to know, why is this a question about ethics? And if it is a question about ethics, is this something that we are obligated to each consider on an individual level? So just.
Yeah, I think to me it's such an exciting and interesting question because it's really dozens and dozens of questions packed into one. And there's so many different ethical angles. There's the obvious question of how different ways of eating harm animals potentially, but there are also questions about the environmental impact of different ways of eating. There are questions about possible exploitation of the workers who are involved in agriculture. There are economic questions. There are cultural and religious. So that there are just so many different angles. The nutritional angle and all of those have important ethical dimensions. So it's really, to me, like, how could this not be a question that we have to wrestle with when it impacts all of these different facets of life?
Good. Yeah. I mean, is my mic on too? Can you hear? Okay. Good. I couldn't agree more, obviously, and I think it's fun for a Prindle Institute of Ethics event to begin with. Is this ethics? Is this a question of ethics? Because nothing, like when you're involved in this kind of work, nothing isn't ethics in a way, right? What do we ever look at that we don't look at as an ethical issue? But but I wanted to think about the nature of the question, which, by the way, many of the questions, if not all of the questions, kind of came through solicitation from students, and so they were then distilled brilliantly. And so this is a question that begins with this idea that we have like a biological nature, and then we can choose this artificial sort of overlay of ethics that we can decide that, and it has sort of has a feel of like, well, there's human nature and then there's ethics, as if like ethics isn't also part of our biological nature. So one of the first things I wanted to do was just to bring that out, and then maybe to kind of pause on the expression "we are biologically omnivores," not because that isn't empirically true, but because the sort of essentialist language that it seems to build in, this sort of there's a thin sense, a scientific sense, where I wouldn't. That's absolutely right. You know, it's also true in a very thin biological sense that we are a heterosexual species, right? But obviously that doesn't mean anything about any one of us in particular here. So that's one of the things I kind of wanted to do, is just we should ask questions about what we mean when we're talking about this essence of our biology. Sometimes that kind of talk has been used in ideologically troubling ways, let's just say, when we talk about human nature. And sometimes that just has to do with who's in power to say, to define, like, what human nature is. So I'll stop because that's something I could go on about, but I have like just tiny little qualms about that. But in terms of the real question, which is what makes eating animals an ethical question, it's everything that Joseph said. It's harm to animals, it's environmental impact, it's the labor processes, it's essentially everything in a complex system. Most of us aren't really taught anything about in great detail as we're growing up. So.
And so because there are all these important moral issues, then is that something like, can I just skate through life without deciding on this issue? Is that something I can do?
Depends on what you mean by can. I mean, people can, they do, but I think the more interesting question is, should you, right? And I would say, no, it's good to think about every aspect of how we live from an ethical perspective, and to think about, is this the right way for me to live? Is this best? What are the values, the relevant questions I should be asking about how I eat, how I spend my money, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, yes, it is possible to try not to think and not to examine our lives and to evade that. It's not necessarily actually succeeding, it's just making another choice. If you choose to not think about it, you're not doing something amoral. You're making a choice that it is itself a moral one.
All right, so it's time to tell us what choices you have made with your lives and your diets. So let us know, just briefly, what kind of food you eat and why you eat the kind of food that you eat.
You start with me. I eat food. No, I'm not too much, mostly plants. That's a Michael Pollan kind of quote. One way you can sort of divide this up into the things you believe and the policies you adopt, and then the practices you actually engage in. So I'll put it this way. At a belief level, I think I lean vegan. I think that for me, the arguments are just pretty compelling, that that's the way I ought to eat. As a matter of practice, that's not what I do. I am pretty much ovo-lacto by policy vegetarian, so I don't tend to eat the animal bodies, but I have yogurt in my oatmeal every single day, you know. And on a level of practice, it's even more flexitarian than that. Like, I don't live up to my principles with some frequency, and there are stories to tell about when and why, and maybe we get into those or maybe we don't. But I don't have a sort of rigid practice that says I won't eat these things and they won't touch the things I eat or anything like that. So mostly plants, some dairy, and the occasional egg.
And I eat mostly meat. I describe my diet as ketovore, so kind of a combination of keto and carnivore, low carb, but mostly meat, eggs, and cheese. I eat most of my meals at Hoover. I love Hoover. I'm grateful for Hoover. I see many of you at Hoover often, and one of the reasons I eat at Hoover is that I can know where my food is being sourced from Hoover, and I know that Hoover's not getting its meat from factory farms. But when I started thinking deeply about this issue, I noticed that a lot of the arguments against meat eating would make a claim like, oh, well, we don't need to eat meat for reasons of health. And what I believe from my own study, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A if people are interested, but I think that for many people, including myself, eating meat actually can make a big difference in terms of health. I think that our species has been eating meat for millions of years and hasn't been eating a lot of the other stuff that we eat today for nearly as long. And so for many people, when we have a diet that's very different from the way we've been eating, I think we run into lots of different health issues. And so for me, when I'm eating right and exercising and sleeping well, all that kind of stuff, it helps me with my mental health. It helps me with my mood, and I've struggled with depression at different points in my life. So it can help me be a better professor, be a better colleague and friend and brother, and so on and so forth. So that's how I eat, and the main reason that I eat that way, ethically.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but are you eating mostly vegetables for the environment because you really like animals?
Yeah, sorry. And maybe we'll get into this more later, but yeah, no, I mean, I definitely do not have the sense that my health depends on eating animals. So it's an option, and I'm very concerned about the conditions that most meat is produced in for the sake of the animals themselves. It's rather horrendous the more you look into it, and I'm not going to trot that kind of thing out, but yeah, the environmental impact of the industrial meat production is pretty horrendous. So that was not what originally brought me to this, but those are the reasons. Yeah, they're moral reasons.
So this is the one that fascinates me, and this is just like endlessly fascinating to me as a not ethicist, as a not philosopher. How do you make decisions like this? Like, this is such a big decision, right? So do you have some frameworks that guide your decision making? Do you have like a core value that you're working with when you decide these sorts of things? Maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, and there's so many things I could say there, but the way I try to break this down as simply as I can is I think a lot of us have this intuition, or maybe it's like, well, it's just wrong to harm animals. We just shouldn't harm animals at all. And the issue there is that if you think it's just always wrong to harm animals, then that doesn't just mean you have to give up eating meat. It means you have to give up driving in cars and like electricity and living in houses that are big, like bigger than you need, and all this stuff. And because all of those things involve harm to animals in different ways. Maybe not as much harm, but there is harm involved. And so I think, well, I don't feel guilty about not living in the forest and foraging. I don't think that's morally required of me. And so the principle, and I just call this SHIP, the significant human interest principle, is that I think that we think that it's okay, and I think that it's okay to harm animals when doing so is necessary to advance a significant human interest. So there are a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to do if we couldn't drive. And I'd be glad if the world were a little less car dependent than it is, but in the world that we live in, we are pretty dependent on cars, especially in a place like Greencastle. And so I think that's a significant human interest. Even though there's harmed animals involved, that's morally okay. And by the same token, if I'm right that, for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, if eating meat is really going to be beneficial to our health, that's one of the things that matters most as far as being able to live our lives and pursue the human good. And so I think that justifies some harms, not all, or not anything goes, but some kinds of harms to animals. So that's like the core intuition I have here.
And just really quickly, I'm not asking you to like prove everything that you just said, but like with electricity, do you mean like squirrels getting electrocuted on electric lines? Or
Oh,
like
no, I mean, those kinds of things do happen. But no, I just mean our overall carbon footprint. And if you think, if you're worried about the environment, that also is a harm that's indirect to all kinds of animals. And these new subdivisions going up are displacing animals and destroying animal habitat. And all of those kinds of things, I think, if you really want to minimize your harm to animals, you'd have to just give up on life in post-industrial society. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. All those sort of indirect animal harms and the environmental context that they're in, I think there really are moral reasons to be concerned about post-industrial society. And so the implication that you should drive less, if you think you should not eat meat because of the environment, you also probably shouldn't drive. And I think because I'm not an absolutist about any of the moral principles I hold, that doesn't bother me very much. It seems, in fact, just right. Like, there are many reasons to be concerned about climate change and other environmental problems, many reasons, and that animal harm, the harm to, our non-domesticated animal people who share the world with us, that just adds to that. That's okay. My principles here are, insofar as they're principles, are not a simple sort of minimize harm kind of principle. Many of you may be taking classes in ethics, and if you aren't, maybe you've seen The Good Place, and so you've seen references to some of the theoretical terms. I don't want to sort of bog down in it, but two of the big frameworks that people have, one is kind of about consequences and harm and trying to do the least harm or the most good that we can with our actions. And another one has to do with rights and the sort of intrinsic worth that individuals may have. I'm not a, die-hard animal rights theorist by any stretch, but my ethical framework has always been a sort of precautionary one. So sort of a Pascal's wager kind of thing. I think it's probably safer to assume that there's more moral worth there than I would like to believe in the case of the chickens and the cows and the ducks and the fish. And the other kind of principles that guide me have to do with power and vulnerability. So I don't think that the significance of the interests that we have, that we should trust the intuition that we're justified in harming beings that might have rights when it looks like we've got something important at stake. I think that we tend to be what do I want to say? We have a little confirmation bias going on. We tend to engage in self-deception when it's convenient for us to do that. We tend to avert our eyes from things that make us uncomfortable. And those to me seem like the most important kind of moral considerations at play here, that we attend to the things that are painful to attend to, and that we're willing to limit what we do for ourselves for the sake of others that we might have duties to. So, kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you both brought up harm, because that's our next question. A lot of students sent in amazing questions. Thank you so much for all of you who sent in questions. A big theme in a lot of the questions was about food production, right? So how certain types of food are produced, right? There were questions about, well, is it okay to eat vegan food that's been that's been grown on a farm that has really unethical labor practices? Like, is that okay, right? Is it okay to eat meat if it's meat from the local sustainable family farm, right? So without getting into too much detailed on the applied stuff, does it make a difference how your food is produced when we're thinking about this set of questions?
You went first last time. I'll go ahead. You probably have, maybe you have more to say. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like the first question. Like, is it an ethics issue? Yeah, it's definitely an ethics issue. Does that matter? Yeah, that matters a lot. One way you could just, the sourcing of the meat in Hoover is a great sort of example of that. If the thing that you're going to put in your mouth sort of went through a kind of horror that you couldn't face, that seems to be important. If it didn't, that also seems important, right? So it's not like, I'm not saying, small sustainable farming, there's no problems there, but it's very different morally. And what about all these ancillary things, I think the kinds of things that Joseph is very good at sort of reminding us of. Vegan diets are not harmless. They're not innocent. And if you care about rights, how about workers' rights? Like, I think it's legit to say that these things are importantly part of our deliberations. I also think that it needs to go beyond that, because again, I don't think that harm is the only relevant thing here. It's not clear to me that it's a benefit to, well, our choices at the individual level may not benefit anybody, but systemic level injustices in the food system may not be best dealt with through individual abstention from eating something produced through bad labor practices. It might be that engagement with those industries more actively would be a better way to do that. So we should care about the laborers doing the work, definitely. I'm probably going on too long. So.
No, I think I agree with pretty much everything you just said. And one of the things to piggyback on your point about confirmation bias is that as I've researched this topic more, one of the things I realized is I think people naively assume, well, if I'm eating something that's plant-based, no harm involved to animals, and that's not true. And there's wide variation. And there's wide variation if you're eating animal-based foods, factory farmed chickens versus locally sourced beef. One of the things I realized was that it's probable, I think very likely, that eating chicken involves a lot more harm to animals than eating beef. And so I realized, okay, if I'm going to be not a hypocrite with the things I'm saying, and I don't think I have any reason to eat chicken, that's a lot more than I should avoid. And I do eat a lot more beef, partly for that reason. So I think there's just so much complexity with these issues. And you read about, avocado farms in Kenya that might be destroying, wild elephant habitat. And it can get really complicated. That's, another reason to be grateful for who. But those questions, there are so many dimensions. And so it is a lot more complicated than just should I eat meat or not.
Yeah.
And it's even like the same kind of food can be produced in totally different ways. And those differences can have huge ethical implications.
Can I follow up? I mean, I just have to agree and sort of want to emphasize this point. Nobody is innocent and off the hook about these things. But also, to me, this kind of underscores the need for something beyond harm to guide us ethically here. With respect to, and I don't know if we disagree about this at all, like factory farm food, the practice of factory farming is essentially, necessarily cruel in a way that like this local sourcing, small sustainable family farm is not essentially so. So to me, that's a sharper divide, but you're right, it can be very surprising when you think about things like one of my big weaknesses when I go off the vegetarian train, it's for sushi, and I feel bad about it, so I try to restrict it to special occasions. But there's, like, it's not at all clear that I can justify that morally in terms of the beings involved, for whom there may be multiple sentient beings consumed at a given meal. Unlike, like, how many meals does one get out of beef? So on the animal harm, you know, on that one, bigger animals are better. Eat whales, you know. You probably only ever need one whale. But on the carbon footprint, you know, if we're going to put that harm into it, then the carbon footprint's higher on the beef than the chicken, so they say in some measure. It's just complicated.
Well, this question I think is maybe the most complicated. It's the most complicated for me. This was another big theme amongst the student questions, was this idea that food is an important cultural issue, right? Food is culture, right? And so because it's such an important cultural issue, there are lots of differences between the way that different groups of people decide to eat, right? So, you know, because there are such big cultural differences, even in just America, right? If we're just talking about the United States, is it possible to make like an unequivocal moral statement about the eating of meat?
No, it's his turn now. I mean,
Well, you know, on the one hand, I think culture matters a lot and matters ethically because it's part of a good life. I think our roots matter. I think being attentive to those kinds of traditions and practices is valuable and part of a complete human life. On the other hand, I'm not a cultural relativist. So if my culture says that human sacrifice is okay, that doesn't make human sacrifice okay. That's just wrong. And so if it turns out that eating meat is absolutely wrong no matter what, then that's true even if, you know, my family has been cattle ranchers for however many generations. And conversely, if it's okay to eat meat under certain circumstances, as I think, then that's going to be true in any cultural context. I do think that the cultural dimension is it's one of the dimensions that I think needs to be considered as we think about how to eat. But I'm not a cultural relativist. So I do think that we can make some of these universal claims.
Can you make it about this issue, though?
Yeah, I think that eating meat is okay or under certain circumstances is okay in any cultural context.
I don't think I'm a cultural relativist. I never really thought, and because that just as a sort of theoretical frame, it's just doesn't fly, doesn't work for the kinds of reasons you talk about. On the other hand, the sort of lived experience of cultural difference and being in different cultural contexts calls for, I just think, a tremendous amount of humility. Not so much humility that we're unwilling to make any kinds of judgments. I don't mean that. But a lot of caution in the judgments that we make. And so one of the contexts where this came up for me a few years ago, I was in Thailand at a study abroad program that we send some students to here, and the director of that program was just like, oh, when the vegans come from the US and they're going to do homestays in Thailand, it's just terrible. You know, it just makes us look bad. And they don't want to host American students because they're rigid vegans and stuff. And I had to think, yeah, you know, that as much as, I mean, I'm fairly firmly convinced on at least some production methods being indefensible. There are cultural things at stake that are, as you would say, like values that need to play in. And sort of being a respectful guest is one. That doesn't mean we can't challenge, and we could give like just absolute weight to, well, it's Thanksgiving, and so we will have the turkey because that's what we do. We have, you know, every family tradition is subject to some nudges and questions, and in fact, it can be a rich part of those traditions to be asking these kinds of questions about them. So that's a really wishy-washy kind of answer, maybe. But given that the way we think about everything is so fundamentally shaped by the cultures we're in, our ideas about which animals count as food and which don't because they're gross and who would eat that, or who would dare eat those because those are our pets, not the food, and no, actually over here they're our food. What are you talking about? Like, I think we have to be really humble about our,
Definitely.
you know, I'm sure we agree.
Yeah.
So we're gonna save quite a bit of time for audience Q&A, but before we do that, I wanted to see if you have questions for each other.
As you know, we do. Sorry. Yeah. Who wants to go first? Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, there's so many questions, but the main one, in this context, you know, there's a lot of conversation about the moral status of different animals, and I think most people have the intuitions that different kinds of animals have different moral status. So that, you know, a mouse matters, but it doesn't matter as much as a human being, or even a dolphin. And so that you can kind of come up with different, and people talk about, well, you know, pigs are really smart, and this species is really smart, and, you know, compared to like a pigeon or something, like there's probably a difference there. So we have this inequality when we're comparing across species, and then on the other hand, most of us want to say, and this is kind of bedrock, I think, for most people, at least in our society, want to say all human beings are of equal moral value. No matter how some of us are smarter, but that doesn't matter. We're all of equal moral value. So I think I feel a little bit of a tension there, and I have my ways of resolving that tension. But I was wondering, do you feel that tension? And if you do you have a way of resolving it, or how do you handle that kind of thing?
Yeah, I love that argument a lot because it's actually offered by some people in sort of as a just straightforwardly, yeah, we need to be consistent about this.
Right.
I'm not willing to say that people who are less, name your criterion, are worth less or should have a reduced status in some sense or a lighter claim on morality. And so that doesn't seem like it's a good basis for valuing some animal lives less. And so maybe we need to think really carefully about what we're saying about the moral status of non-humans and when we're making these sort of gradations among them. Some, you know, as you know, some philosophers just handle this way. They say every being that has interests count, and all of their interests count. And insofar as they're comparable, they count the same amount. So if I have a headache, I can't come and do this, say. And so there's the come to the Prindle event and speak interest. And then there's just plain the interest in not having a headache. And, you know, people who hold this kind of view would say, well, you know, your cat's interest in not having a headache just by itself is no less important than yours. just by itself. It's just that we can add up, you know, a bunch of other things. That's called a principle of equal consideration of interests. It's not honestly my favorite way of dealing with this kind of issue, because when I just think of moral status as a categorical concept as opposed to a kind of quantitative concept. So if something has, I like the language, is morally considerable, what that means is it's the kind of thing that we can do wrong to. We can wrong the mouse. We can wrong each other. And then there's fun debates about whether we can wrong mosquitoes or trees or ecosystems and lakes and stuff like that. But all those vertebrates are going to get into the class of beings that we can do wrong to. It's just the interesting question is, what is it to do wrong to them? And then I would go back to a certain amount of humility in our judgments about relative value, because maybe a mouse is just like a really, really small elephant, you know, or like I feel like there's often we may be using irrelevant kind of factors in our judgments there, and when we say, oh, it's okay to do this to those ones, we can't hear them very well when they object.
Squirtin' hears a who, right?
Right, right.
I'm a parent, so I don't know if anybody else gets that. But
yeah. So that's. I have. I guess it's a question about the significant human interest significant human interest principle, in a way, and I think the crux of it is this, like, yeah, health is good, but can't you be healthy enough that then other beings' interests just kind of become more important? And the sort of thought experiment version of this is like, so, you know, you're pretty healthy right now, but suppose I had, sorry, philosopher time, playing games with thought experiments, suppose I had a pill, and the pill would make you even healthier than you are. Like, give you extra years on your life or whatever, but every single one of them is going to require killing a pig. Yeah. And so to me it seems like you patently shouldn't take that pill, even though obviously there's a significant human interest for you. Do you agree?
So I think this is a great question because it helps me think through how I think about these issues. So my answer is going to be it depends. Classic philosopher answer, I know. But so one thing that's important to say is that from my perspective, the kinds of health issues that I think can be ameliorated with the kind of diet the kind of way of eating I practice are it's not minor things like, oh, you know, I cleared up my acne by, you know, eating meat. So, and it's things like diabetes and heart disease and like pretty serious, and things that are called the diseases of modernity oftentimes, which I think is telling as far as why are these diseases so prevalent in our post-industrial societies. But I think to me the question depends a lot, when I think about this, it depends a lot on, well, what am I doing with that extra health? Am I taking the money that I'm saving on healthcare and being generous with it? Am I taking the time that I'm saving and being generous with it? If it's more time, you know, to serve people and be with my family and whatever the case may be, then that seems morally significant stuff. If it's, wow, I can take this pill and that's 5 more years of scrolling through TikTok, like that doesn't seem as morally significant to me. So I think about that famous line from Saving Private Ryan when Tom Hanks says, you know, earn this. And I think if I'm going to say, that was a pretty good Tom Hanks impression, I know. If I'm going to say that I have certain significant interests involved in my life that justify certain harms, and if I'm trying to avoid, as I am, the kind of confirmation bias that you've done a great job of highlighting, you know, throughout this discussion, then I have to think really seriously about, well, I need to live a generous and loving and positive life, and that can be morally significant. So I think a lot of it is going to depend on, well, what are we doing with that health? And if we're doing good things and beautiful things and noble things, then that starts to sound more weighty to me. And if we're not, then I think, no, there's no chance then that pill could be justified.
The podcaster in me has to say that you're a PhD doctor, not a doctor. So check with your doctor before you make any significant dietary changes.
And then check with, no, I'm just
kidding. Yeah. So this is great. So there are so many of you here. I want to hear from the crowd. So I think what we're going to do is Jeff is going to pass around a mic. And I'd wait until you get the mic, just in case there are people that are hard of hearing in the room. And so I'll help point out who I see raising their hand. I saw you raise your hand right away. So this gentleman right up here.
Well, I don't have a question. I have like a point of view or a comment. Is that valid too?
Is what?
Is it okay to have a point of view rather than a question?
Oh.
Yeah.
Sure. I don't see why not.
Well, yeah. My opinion is this: that all this discussion that has been based on if it's ethical or not to consume meat is based on two premises, right? That the meat consumption harm the environment and harm the health. The problem is those two premises are right only, as you correctly say, only when it regards to a factory farm. Mm-hmm. But there are plenty of traditional methods of cattle raising that are not harmful to the environment. It has said that it's harmful to the environment because ruminants release methane, and methane is a climate change gas, That methane is formed with carbon that is recirculated from the air. So it's not adding new carbon into the air. Unlike when you drive your car, you are releasing carbon that has been buried on the ground for 200 million years. Mm-hmm. The carbon that the cows release is carbon that the plant fixed from the air. Photosynthesis fix the carbon, the cow eat the grass, and the carbon go back. So it's neutral, it's carbon neutral. So it's not true that it harms the environment. In fact, it can help the environment because the feces from the cows can enrich the soil, and the amount of carbon that can be stored in the soil far exceed the amount of carbon that they release with methane when they erupt. That in regard to the harm to the environment. In harm to the humans, as you correctly said, humans, since we are humans, 200,000 years ago, we have been eating meat. And even before that, Australopithecus, 200 million years ago, we were eating meat. So natural evolution have adjusted humans to be depending on meat to satisfy the physiology needs. Some people say, oh, because we have flat teeth, then that's a proof that we don't eat meat. Well, guess what? Gorillas are 100% herbivores, and they have very sharp and long teeth. So that is not a reason. So the problem here is that if we stop eating meat, then we are not satisfying some basic needs. The problem with the consumption of meat is the excess. Humans were able to eat meat, but they eat meat only when they were lucky enough to hunt an antelope, because they didn't have guns, right? So they have to run behind the antelope, and that was very hard. So they were able to eat meat once a week, twice a week, but now we eat meat every day. So that is the problem. So it's the excess of meat consumption, not meat consumption itself. And the other thing is that if we don't eat meat, nobody's gonna raise cattle. So those species will go extinct. Is it ethical to let a species disappear?
So good. Okay, so many things, right? Really complicated, not really complicated, but definitely deep and detailed empirical questions at play here, and philosophers, But what I hear is taking carbon dioxide out of the air, but putting it back out as methane has no carbon impact. I'm not sure. I don't really want...
Methane only lasts 20 years in the environment.
How many years do we have?
But CO2 lasts
I know.
Yes.
Yes, I know. That's a big difference. But we have a short-term kind of contribution to warming that's concerning. It's actually not what I wanted to say, though. What I wanted to say is that the point about the excess is dead on. We wouldn't have factory farming if we didn't eat so much and want it so cheap.
Yes, that's
So like eating a lot less would make a big difference. And as far as the rest of the like nutritional picture and the environmental picture and so on, there's a clear difference between factory farming and, yeah, I agree.
I saw a question right behind you. Yeah, in the red shirt. Yep. I don't know why I said that. I know your name. Sorry.
Yeah, hi, I'm Madeline. I'll just say that. I actually wanted to ask you a question about something you brought up with, I guess I'm forgetting the way you worded it, but sort of how each person sort of determines the value of like their meat consumption and like how it might personally benefit them. I guess I'm just curious, how do you know that a person is qualified? Like, how can you say, I don't know, if you say, oh, I want to take that pill and have 5 more years of TikTok life, and you might say, oh, well, that's not right, that's not fair. Like, how do you determine that someone's qualified to make that decision, or does everyone just get to?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, so there are a couple things there could be. Are you asking like should there be like legal constraints or? No, yeah, no. I mean, I think that most. I think pretty much anyone can be qualified, can put in. I don't think most people, and in particular most meat eaters, have put in the work, have thought very reflectively about their eating practices. And most meat eaters aren't eating what I would consider a healthy diet. So they can't point to nutrition, say, oh, it's so, like if you're getting a burger with the fries and the shake, you can't say, well, it's like that's not healthy. I think everyone can agree. So I think that, I mean, I've put in a lot of work thinking about the empirical questions and the ethical questions, and I don't think everyone has to put in the same amount. But I think kind of given our different contexts and given our, we do have to think carefully and reflectively and in a way that's not just letting ourselves off too easy about these questions, about the moral significance of the choices that we're making. And I think that's something that most people can do, but I don't think most people are really doing that on a consistent basis. And I think vegans tend to be much better about that, I'd say, on average, than meat eaters. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it did.
Anybody can be simple-minded about but what I like a great deal about what Joseph has been offering is not just the sort of general injunction to be thoughtful and think, but to like is there kind of like a principle of reciprocity of some kind involved here, that like if I'm going to benefit from this profound loss on the part of these beings, I owe something back.
Yeah.
And granted, it's not paid back to those beings, but it's rather weighty, right? It doesn't just come down to, well, somebody somewhere is making that meat in a nice way. It's happy over there, so I'll just dig in with whatever I've got at hand. Like, that's not what's being offered here. I didn't answer the question about about driving cows to extinction, and I'm just going to say I'd be happy to later, but I don't want to cut off other questions.
And there's a question over here, and then there's a question back there as well.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Lily. I wanted to ask about pescatarianism. So a lot of people become pescatarians, and I don't know all the reasons. I know that a lot of it is because they want to, they feel sympathy for animals that are not fish. I actually do not eat seafood, but I will eat other meat, and that is because of the way that a lot of seafood is killed. like, for example, lobsters boiled alive. So do you believe that, and this is probably more a question for you, do you believe that pescatarianism is ethically a step up from eating all meat? Do you believe that it makes more sense to be a pescatarian or more sense to be someone who does not eat seafood but eats other meat? Or what are your feelings about that?
Thank you. Thank you. In my heart of hearts, what I believe is that if you're going to eat animals, eat very big ones and share with many people, right? That one being to go through its death and sacrifice, the more people who can be satisfied with that, the better. And on those grounds, it's very hard to justify eating fish. I understand and feel it myself. Like, I'm drawn, right? I find it tasty. Haven't had beef in forever. Can't even remember really what it is like. But I remember, you know. And so I think it's just honestly being overcome. It's like, I don't want to give this up for those who go that way. I think you can try to say something about the sophistication of the animals involved or whatever, but I think it's kind of self-serving to try and convince ourselves that fish don't suffer. They probably do. Do shrimp? I don't know. I think we should give the benefit of the doubt. Do clams? I don't know, but it, again, it seems like you can err on the side of safety and just get yourself a big old whale. I don't know.
Thank you. There's a question right back there.
Hi, my name is Cece. So I think that, like, just to preference, because I feel like I'm really happy the last question went first, because I'm a pescatarian. And so I've been a pescatarian for the last 3 years, but I did not become a pescatarian because, like, okay, please don't cancel me. I did not become a pescatarian because I'm like, I care about the animals' feelings. I think that maybe that's something I haven't explored yet. Probably I won't end up caring. But okay. I became a pescatarian because when I was a sophomore, I believe, I found out about a lot of the GMO and about a lot of the just a lot of the bad stuff that was going into the meat. And I'm from I guess we would call it like an underserved. I lived in a food desert, so I'm from New York City, and so my community was in a food desert up until very recently, and a lot of the meat that we have was just not good meat. And so in my mind, it's like, I'm not gonna put that into my body. However, I do believe that it is important for just my own opinion, but I do believe that meat is important for culture and it's important for humanity. I believe it always has been, and I believe that it always will be. And so my question, I guess, is, do you see a world where we can create healthy, because I would love to go back to meat, I'm just not putting that in my body. So I guess my question is, do you see a world in which we can create healthy and affordable meat for everyone? And then also just to say that, like, I feel like our culture, a lot of people have stopped eating meat as like a trend. So it's a trend to say like, oh, flexitarian, like my little brother, like, I'm a vegan half the time. I was like, that's not a thing. Like, either you're a vegan or you're not.
It is a thing, right?
And so I feel like a lot of people have stopped eating meat, and they don't understand a lot that goes into the meat industry. They don't understand a lot that the meat has for our culture and for humanity. And so do you see culture going into, do you see people being willing, or culture even going into a place where people wanting to create healthy and affordable meat? Or do you see culture continuing to shift in a place where people are going towards plant-based or not eating meat?
Who do you want to take your question?
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up the question of food deserts and just and underserved communities in general, because one of the reasons I'm passionate about this issue is that it's so clear to me that our healthcare system is failing so many people, but people in those kinds of communities in particular. And so to me, I look at this as like there may be a way out. And in the context of harm, I mean, we spend trillions of dollars on healthcare. And so much of that is just managing, rather than curing people's conditions, just managing them long term. And if just a fraction of those resources could be diverted to making more nutritious food more easily available to those people, I think it could be a really, not that it'd be a utopia, but I think it could end up being a win-win-win for humans and animals and the environment, because we just have such a dysfunctional, in my view, healthcare system. So that's one part of your question. I think Jen maybe wants to touch on some of the other parts, but
Well,
I think that's so important.
Yeah, I'm worried that I won't touch on the things that you want me to touch on. But what I most want to say is that the intersection of injustices of geographic nature and environmental nature, right? So not a good supply of healthy food, tons of supply of really polluting, nasty industries, and cheap meat that is far from healthy. That's, as you say, right, full of the things that are not good. So we do have to recognize one of the problems with widespread availability of the kind of meat that we're talking about in these cases. It's, raised in pretty happy conditions and environmentally far more beneficial, not so toxic and not so polluting, and not so full of hormones and antibiotics that are also then polluting the waterways and so on and so on. But can we scale that up so that everybody has lots of it and it's cheap? No, that's called factory farming. Scaled up for everybody to have plenty of it and it's cheap requires factory farming. There's no other way, as far as I can tell. So what do I think needs to be done about this stuff? Yes, better availability of healthy foods of all kinds, but all of the geographic injustice is part of this story. And I certainly don't think that people who have already a limited set of viable healthy foods available need to be going out of the way and spending inordinate amounts of money to have the vegan diet. And is it trendy? Yeah, people do this kind of thing for trends all the time. In fact, it can be part of eating disorders too, right? That people can adopt veganism as a sort of way of restricting the diet in order to restrict the calories. And so sometimes eating disorder like treatment programs will not allow people to be vegan, right? Because it's a manifestation of something else. It's complicated. All these things go together.
So we've got 2 minutes left. So who has a short question? We'll do one more short question. I haven't picked from this side very much. So how about there's a person right in the second row.
So this could be either or, but I've seen that there's a difference between factory farming and local sustainable farming. But something, especially in rural regions, that's very popular is hunting deer, in which it serves an ecological purpose of sustaining the healthy environment by curtailing the deer population in the absence of predators. So my question would be, in that situation, beyond just like harm reduction, could that present a moral obligation to eat meat in that situation?
I guess the first thing I want to say is it's so much better, from my point of view, to take responsibility for the animals that you're going to eat. To be, if you're going to eat them, that you're able to see that process all the way through. There's a ton of integrity in that, and I grew up with people who hunted. Deer overpopulation is often handled through cars, roadkill, and I know of some vegans who only eat roadkill. that's something that can be done if you're right on the scene real quick and blah, blah, blah. There often are places that will do that. Wildlife management is tricky and complicated, so I don't like a lot of things.
White hawks, actually.
What's that?
White hawk.
White hawks?
They're becoming a problem because they are growing in abundance, so they need hunters.
Yeah,
Control
yeah,
the numbers.
right. I mean, there is such a thing as therapeutic hunting. Yeah.
Well, so I'll just say, the first thing I'll say is if there's some vegans who catch roadkill, then I know some rednecks who might be surprised to find out that they're vegans. But the second thing I'll say, because I think it's good to end on a hot take, is that I'd be willing to defend the claim that under some circumstances people are morally obligated to eat meat. And I think that hunting, like you're describing, can be one of the kind of lowest harm, highest benefit circumstances.
Well, so we're right at 8:30. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Christian.
And I hope it's okay for me to speak for both of you. I think you'd both be willing to talk more about this, maybe not tonight, but at some point, if you catch them on campus somewhere.
yeah.
So, thanks.
At Hoover.
At Hoover.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone for coming out and for the great questions and great discussion. If you liked this and you want more, we're going to have another courageous conversation in ethics next semester with Jason Brennan, a philosopher at Georgetown Business School, and Sharik Siddiqui, the director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at IU, are going to discuss the ethics of philanthropy and making money. So look out for that if you liked this. And let's thank all of our participants one more time. Good night.